any other period of life. There are significant differences in the incidence of bacterial meningitis by season. These are the common organisms which cause bacterial meningitis. Topmost is of course Streptococcus pneumoniae, which causes lobar pneumonia and also invades the leptomeninges, causing bacterial meningitis. Next to that is the meningococcal meningitis. Streptococcus pneumoniae causes almost 40% of all pyogenic meningitis. Meningococci, they cause around 15%. Haemophilus influenzae and Staph aureus 5% each. And then there are all sorts of organisms depending on the age and immune status of the person. Other organisms, especially in neonates and infants at the age of 2 to 3 months, are E. coli, Staph aureus, beta hemolytic streptococcus, Staph epidermidis, and Listeria monocytogenes. In immunocompromised host, again Listeria tops the list, and gram-negative bacteria. Last lecture we studied most of the cases of HIV, they develop tubercular meningitis or CNS tuberculosis as an end, and they die of tuberculosis. But sometimes they can present with pyogenic meningitis due to Listeria monocytogenes. And those patients who had a contact with the hospital in last 3 months for some other reason, for ENT, ophthalm, ortho, any other problem, if they have visited the hospital and then they develop meningitis, probably they have the bacteria coming from the hospital, Klebsiella, E. coli, Pseudomonas, and Staph aureus as a cause of meningitis. How does bacteria reach the meninges? The major route to the leptomeningeal infection is blood. So mostly it is a blood-borne infection. Patient of pneumococcus developing lobar pneumonia, the bacteria go into the bloodstream and then they reach meninges. Uncommonly, meningitis can occur as a direct extension from nearby focus, especially mastoiditis and sinusitis. Chronic suppurative otitis media is very important cause of direct invasion, and especially the temporal plate of bone, which is very thin, the bacteria can break that barrier and can enter into the leptomeninges. So every patient of pyogenic meningitis, we ask history of any ear discharge, or we have ENT opinion for any perforation or mastoiditis. Sometimes the direct invasion is because of traumatic injury, especially the cribriform plate, which is again very thin. If there is nasal bone fracture or fractures of maxilla and bones of the face, sometimes there can be fracture going into the base of the skull. And then there is a CSF rhinuria, CSF leaks. So as CSF starts leaking, bacteria can go other way around. They can enter into the CSF and go inside. Sometimes meningomyelocele or dermoid or sinus tract can cause direct invasion of bacteria into the meninges. Pathogenesis, offending bacterium from blood invades the leptomeninges and releases certain toxins and inflammatory mediators. The bacterial toxins are lipopolysaccharides, teichoic acid, and peptidoglycans. Inflammatory mediators are tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukins, and prostaglandin E2. And all these inflammatory mediators cause infiltration of inflammatory cells. They cause vessel dilatation, vascular permeability, tissue edema, and then the blood-brain barrier is destroyed. And then there is a thrombosis inside the vessels, especially venous sinuses, where the blood is very slowly flowing and then can be a thrombosis. This purulent material over the convexity of the brain can go into the depths of the sulci, can go around the veins and venous sinuses. It can enter into the basal systems. Worst, it can enter into the ventricles and cause ventriculitis. And the pus going down the thin aqueduct of Sylvius can block, or excess inflammatory fluid in the ventricles can cause either communicating or non-communicating type of hydrocephalus. Pus can get localized in the subdural space, causing subdural empyema. And then the meningeal exudates, they are of various varying thickness, and they can invade cerebellum, spinal cord, and they can go into the spinal roots. There can be vasculitis, especially endothelial cell injury to the vessels can lead to vessel stenosis and secondary infection, secondary ischemia, and then infarction. Ventricular dilatation can lead to necrosis of cerebral tissue, occlusion of cerebral veins or arteries. A vascular problem we learned last time in tubercular meningitis, it's chronic type of meningitis, is more severe. And last time we discussed that obstructive hydrocephalus or vascular stroke occurring in tubercular meningitis can cause bad prognosis. In bacterial meningitis, arterial infarctions, they are relatively less. But thick pus going into the superior sagittal transverse sigmoid sinus can cause venous infarct. There are atypical strokes. Veins getting blocked also can lead to stroke. And there is a tremendous rise of pressure inside the blood brain in the brain because of stagnated blood, venous sinus thrombosis, which can cause flurry of seizures. So patient presenting with flurry of seizures, headache, vomiting, neck stiffness, and the CSH showing plenty of pus cells, I think we should suspect venous sinus thrombosis. Cerebral edema can cause damage to the cortex, and it also can lead to convulsions. If there is a diffuse involvement of white matter of the brain, even it can cause altered brain function and can lead to coma. It can lead to multiple cranial nerve palsies. But you know, cranial nerves, they arise from the brainstem. And in tubercular meningitis, pus accumulates more at the base. So multiple cranial nerve palsies, they are very common with tubercular meningitis. Pyogenic meningitis, the pus we are discussing here, is more evenly spread on the hemispheres and the sulci and the gyri. So there is more chance of venous sinus thrombosis. So the patient presents with a hemiplegia in a setting of bacterial meningitis, you should suspect either venous sinus thrombosis or brain abscess. If it is tubercular meningitis, you should suspect vasculitis, vessel thrombosis, and arterial infarction. What are the symptoms of meningitis? Meningococcal meningitis can lead to release of toxins in the blood and septicemia. Meningococcal septicemia can be a horrible disease. You know that it's called as the Waterhouse Friderichsen syndrome, where there can be hemorrhages in the adrenal gland leading to acute adrenal insufficiency. There can be petechiae or hemorrhage occurring all over the body very acutely in 1 or 2 days. But sometimes it may take a little longer. Many cases it can occur very fast in few hours. Symptoms and signs of upper respiratory tract or GI infections are found in several cases. Some patients may present suddenly with shock. Presenter view, where is the presenter view? ये recording से button को नहीं तेरे दाबी somebody else.
Excuse me, sir. Sir, you are not audible. Hello?
Sorry, sorry. Is it audible now? Audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you. So there was some technical problem. Somebody was trying to record the lecture and probably the slides went off. So I'll take back and discuss last two slides which I did not discuss now. These are the slides on toxic manifestations in the CNA in general. Then CNS manifestations we discussed, headache, vomiting, and convulsions, coma. And signs we discussed two signs, the Kernig sign and the Brud-Jenkins sign. In Brud-Jenkins we discussed leg sign and neck sign. Sorry for that mistake. Okay, so there was some technical problem. Coming to the complications of meningitis, the neurological complications, first is seizures. Am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Seizures occur in about 20 to 30% of children with bacterial meningitis. Often manifestation of Haemophilus influenzae or pneumococcal infections, and it's caused by brain parenchymal inflammation, cerebral infarction, sometimes electrolyte disturbances. Especially I talked about meningococcal septicemia, there is adrenal hemorrhage and adrenal insufficiency. So there is a sudden deficit of glucocorticoids because of adrenal deficiency. It can lead to various electrolyte manifestations, and severe hyponatremia or even hypernatremia can cause convulsions. Next is altered consciousness, and it could be from drowsiness to clouding of consciousness to coma. Some patients can manifest with the psychiatric symptoms, especially dullness, irritation, and dysphoria. Cranial nerve palsy is already I discussed to you. Cranial nerves, they arise from midbrain, pons, and medulla. So the cranial outflow is around the brainstem, and in tubercular meningitis, also called as a basal meningitis, pus tends to accumulate at the base of the brain in the posterior fossa, and then there is the involvement of cranial nerves which causing multiple cranial nerve palsies. In bacterial meningitis, the pus is more on the hemispheres. So sagittal sinus, transverse sinus, sigmoid sinus thrombosis, or invasion of the brain leading to encephalitis, localized invasion leading to brain abscess, more common. So cranial nerve palsy is more common with tubercular meningitis. But in bacterial meningitis, certain cranial nerves they get involved. Optic nerve involvement can lead to blindness. Bilateral sixth nerve palsy because of raised intracranial tension, which is a false localizing sign, is very often seen in bacterial meningitis. And there can be transient or permanent paralysis of limbs and cranial nerves. Transient, so it may not be permanent. So this is a very typical skin picture of meningococcal septicemia and Waterhouse-Friderichsen syndrome. What is the differential diagnosis of meningitis? Already we discussed the common causes of meningitis are bacterial, viral, and tuberculous, but there are certain uncommon causes and which can manifest like a meningitis, especially Behçet's disease, benign recurrent lymphocytic meningitis, which is called as a molarate meningitis, fungal meningitis, ehrlichiosis, HIV infections of the CNS, leptomeningeal carcinomatosis, neuroborreliosis, Borrelia burgdorferi infection called as the Lyme's disease, neoplastic meningitis, neurosarcoidosis, neurosyphilis, and then various types of vasculitis including SLE. Few slides on viral meningitis. 90% of all viral meningitis are caused by enteroviruses, and these enteroviruses, commonly the common cold virus, rhinoviruses or Coxsackie viruses, and some cases they are caused besides enteroviruses is arboviruses like dengue, chikungunya, and your Nipah virus and swine flu which had come. So all these are transmitted through the arthropod-borne infections. Sometimes adenoviruses like measles, herpes simplex, and varicella. Around 10 to 15 million or more symptomatic infections occur every year in the US. So if you see the COVID problem today, I think it's a very less compared to the viral infections which people face, influenza viral infections every year. And even simple influenza can kill 10 times more patient than COVID. But because COVID is new problem, most of the population is susceptible, and there was a hype created by media, and there is a fear created by overall atmospheres. There is anxiety about this illness. But if you see the statistics, I think 10 times more patients they get influenza everywhere compared to the coronavirus. And there are more deaths than coronavirus every year in US and worldwide because of influenza. So I think we have to deal it bravely, but corona we should not take very seriously. Viral meningitis can be due to reservoirs like enteroviruses. They are transmitted from one person to the other, human to human transmission, measles, herpes, and varicella. But in arboviruses, birds and rodents, they are the reservoirs. In arthropod-borne infections, the arthropod vectors are required for transmission of arboviruses. If you take an example of dengue, the mosquito is required for transmission of dengue infection. And I'm afraid that rainy season is approaching now, and we are focusing more on corona, but probably in June and July we'll have mixed problems, lot of lepto, lot of malaria, or lot of dengue infections along with corona will be coming. And our focus should not be only on this, but we have to pay attention to even other viruses and parasitic infections also. No specific treatment is available for viral meningitis. One word about aseptic meningitis. Okay, so what is aseptic meningitis? Is a syndrome characterized by acute onset of meningeal symptoms, fever, CSF cell count, fluid pleocytosis, and simultaneously you cannot grow bacteria in the CSF. There are a lot of pus cells. Meningitis is very classic. CSF picture shows a lot of cells, but it is a sterile type of meningitis. So it is called as a aseptic meningitis. Mostly caused again by viral infections. In aseptic meningitis, CSF shows less than 5 cells per cubic millimeter. And one important criterion is there is no evidence of bacterial or fungal infection. So it's a clinically compatible illness diagnosed by a physician as aseptic meningitis with no laboratory evidence of bacterial or fungal infection. It's called as aseptic meningitis. Now we come back to the topic of bacterial meningitis. What are the complications of bacterial meningitis? As I told you, 75% of the times the children and infants they are affected by bacterial infections in the brain. As such, in adult practice, medicine practice, we see less number of bacterial meningitis. Mostly they are because of CSOM, mastoiditis, or some other ways the infections they are transmitted to the brain, even sometimes because of head injury. So the incidence prevalence is less in adults. So complications in children is subdural effusion, around 30%, ependymitis, which leads to hyperpyrexia and convulsions. One interesting syndrome called SIADH. You know, there is one hormone coming from the hypothalamus stored in postpituitary, said to be a hormone of postpituitary, but actually it is storage. Pituitary is the storage tank, and that hormone is aqueous vasopressin, or it is a vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone, which is responsible for reabsorption of water from the kidneys and maintaining the water balance. If there is a deficiency of this ADH, it leads to polyuria, polydipsia syndrome, that is called as diabetes insipidus. Diabetes is siphoning out of fluid from the body. It's because of sugar, it is mellitus. If it is because of ADH deficiency, it is insipidus. So these two diseases, diabetes, they are different. Diabetes insipidus is because of ADH deficiency. Diabetes mellitus is due to insulin problem. Either there is a hyperinsulinemia, but it is not effective, type 2 diabetes, or there is an actual deficiency of insulin as in type 1 diabetes. So these two diabetes you should know very well. So diabetes insipidus is deficiency of antidiuretic hormone, which is the problem which is diagonally opposite to ADH deficiency and diabetes insipidus. Opposite is a SIADH. Exactly opposite, 180-degree opposite problem, SIADH. SIADH is syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone. Diabetes insipidus, there is ADH deficiency. So in this problem, SIADH, there is other way around, excess secretion of antidiuretic hormone. And there are a lot of causes. Easy to remember, all those CNS, CVS, RS problem which happen in ICU. What sort of patients? If you have visited intensive care unit, you see cases of strokes, see cases of septicemia, see cases of head injury, you see cases of renal injury and acute or chronic kidney disease patients. So all these patients, brain tumor patients, stroke patients, all can cause excess secretion of antidiuretic hormone. And then if there is a lot of ADH in the body, secreted in the body, it will cause a lot of water conservation. So kidneys fail to excrete water. So water logging is there. Now this water logging, excess water which is stagnated leads to dilutional hyponatremia. So sodium is same, but water is excess. So it is a dilution of sodium leads to dilutional hyponatremia. And it also causes leg edema. And sometimes it can cause cerebral edema also. So SIDH in pyogenic meningitis can aggravate cerebral edema. Then it leads to frequent convulsions and altered consciousness. We already discussed there can be ventriculitis or thick pus going into the aqueduct of Sylvius can block the ventricles and can lead to obstructive hydrocephalus. Sometimes the inflammatory fluid is so much that even though the aqueduct is patent, there is a passive dilatation, and this leads to non-communicating hydrocephalus. Other rare complications are deafness, blindness, epilepsy. In children, it can cause mental retardation or behavioral disorder. And in two settings, if there is a venous sinus thrombosis or brain abscess, it can lead to paralysis, hemiparesis or hemiplegia. What are the investigations of pyogenic meningitis? Peripheral smear, which will show leukocytosis. WBC count goes up more than 11,000. So very often it is 16, 20,000. We have seen WBC counts going up to 30,000, 35,000 and raising a suspicion of even leukemias. So very high counts can happen. And 80 to 90% of the times there are neutrophils in the peripheral blood. Definite investigation is lumbar puncture and CSF examination. Routine CSF examination, especially for pressure, cells, appearance, glucose, protein, and culture. Specific bacterial antigen tests like countercurrent immunoelectrophoresis, latex agglutination, immunofluorescence test, all can be done. Sometimes we have to go for LDH, lactic acid, C-reactive protein, TNF-alpha, or immunoglobulins, especially if you are suspecting some other cause of meningitis. Now, this table is very crucial. How to differentiate between pyogenic, tubercular, aseptic, various types of meningitis, even viral meningitis, and fungal meningitis. In pyogenic meningitis, easy to remember, count goes in thousands, so 8,000, 10,000, so multiples of 1,000, 10,000, 15,000. And most of these cells, 80 to 90% of these cells are neutrophils, very high protein levels because of inflammation as well as sheer cell load. Cells are so much that it can release protein, can be counted as protein. Chances of detecting bacteria is around 70%. Very good. Unfortunately, many of these patients, they receive empirical antibiotics from family physician or general practitioner in the villages, not knowing that patient has bacterial meningitis, and when the patient comes to the hospital, is partially treated. So their diagnosis becomes a bit difficult because cell count drops down, and it can cause confusion with chronic meningitis like tubercular or fungal meningitis. WBC count is in hundreds, proteins are high, and because patient has already received bacteria, the chance of detecting organisms in the culture becomes less. Listeria monocytogenes is one atypical type of bacterium which causes infection, especially in immunocompromised hosts, can come close in differential diagnosis of bacterial meningitis. Here again, the count is in hundreds, proteins are more than 50, and organism chance detection is very less, 30%. Aseptic meningitis already we discussed, where there is a classic picture suggestive of bacterial meningitis, but actually it is caused by viral infection. And very important, there are no organisms. So you do whatever culture, you do peripheral smear, you will not find any organisms in the CSF. Proteins are way high. That differentiates it from viral meningitis, but mostly cause is viral. In viral meningitis, the protein count is less. Here protein count is more, causing close DD of bacterial meningitis, tubercular meningitis, but culture is negative. Then tubercular meningitis, last time we discussed, count is in hundreds, 600, 700, 800, and very important, all these cells, they are lymphocytes. Protein is way high, more than any other meningitis, and chances of detecting TB bacteria in the CSF is very less. So that's why we discussed last time, you have to go around and do other tests. You find evidence of tuberculosis somewhere else, especially tubercular lymphadenitis or pulmonary tuberculosis, some other focus is present, that solves the problem. Fungal meningitis, typically cryptococcal meningitis, occurs in a setting of HIV, and CSA picture is very close to tubercular meningitis, so much so that the first diagnosis made is tubercular meningitis, but a clever physician will ask for TI suppression because in case of immunodeficiencies, he wants to rule out fungal meningitis, and there is a very high chance of detecting Cryptococcus neoformans, that's a budding fungi, against a blue background of that India, and I have seen few cases, dozen cases of cryptococcal meningitis. Chances of detecting Cryptococcus neoformans are so high that diagnosis solely depends on that, finding out the budding fungi in India in preparation of CSA. Imaging studies I did not include here, but imaging studies, they have a role, especially if patient has presented with a neurodeficit, has got hemiparesis, then we have to look for any brain abscess or any vascular involvement or infarction. Otherwise also you will find there is a very diffuse type of inflammation and collection of fluid in the sulci gyri. You can detect hydrocephalus, either communicating or non-communicating, or you can even pick up subdural empyema in case of children. So all sorts of complications of meningitis you can pick up imaging studies. But for diagnosis, I think CSF is a gold standard test. You have to do lumbar puncturing. Last part of the lecture, how to treat meningitis. Antibiotic therapy is pivotal. It is an infection, bacterial infection. So only hope for cure for patients is proper antibiotic. And while selecting the antibiotic, you have to confirm first it is a bacterial meningitis. It's not some other thing like viral or fungal, and very often tubercular. If it is a tubercular meningitis, which comes very close for a partially treated pyogenic meningitis, and if you make a diagnosis of partial treated bacterial meningitis and start antibiotics, unfortunately, if the patient has TB, then he may not respond, he may worsen. So first you have to confirm the diagnosis. Then decide whether it's a community acquired bacterial infection or hospital acquired. Because we discussed organisms are different for community acquired and bacterial acquired in hospital acquired infection. and the spectrum of antibiotics we are using is going to be different. For various organisms, the antibiotics which are preferred, Nigerian meningitis, it's a penicillin and cephalosporins. Penicillin is not available. There was an era when I was a young lecturer and even postgraduate student used to use penicillin left, right for each and every patient. That was the era of penicillin. I don't think I used to write penicillin to less than 10 patients every day. And now we are not getting the classic crystalline penicillin or Procan penicillin anymore. It's not available. But for rheumatic fever prophylaxis, long-acting penicillin, benzathine penicillin is still available. Still available at only few select centers like government hospitals, not everywhere. But I personally feel it's a very good antibiotic, and unfortunately, there is no availability of this drug. I'm still interested in using this drug, but it's not available. Very close alternative to penicillin, which is used rampantly nowadays, and sometimes it is misused, and all GPs they use this drug as a first line drug, and that is cephalosporins, especially ceftriaxone sodium. In Streptococcus pneumoniae, one added antibiotic is vancomycin. In Haemophilus influenzae, the antibiotic of choice remains ampicillin, and Staph aureus, it's a napsilin or vancomycin. For E. coli, which are gram-negative infections, which are probably originating from urinary tract or GI, the antibiotic of choice remains ampicillin or cephalosporin, and the age-old antibiotic chloramphenicol sometimes works wonders. I still remember that era when we used chloramphenicol a lot, ample, especially typhoid was very common problem in those era. Chloramphenicol was a drug of choice. But chloramphenicol sometimes can cause severe bone marrow depression, and if it is a idiosyncratic or anaphylactic type of bone marrow depression, patient even can die. But other types of bone marrow depression caused by chloramphenicol is reversible, it's dose dependent. I still feel it is again wonderful broad spectrum antibiotic, but hype created by most of the references coming in the journals that it causes pancytopenia, it causes bone marrow suppression. There is a undue anxiety about using this antibiotic. Again, this drug is not that freely available. But sometimes in tricky cases in ICU, I still use chloramphenicol, but it's a good choice, broad spectrum antibiotic. What's the duration of treatment in meningococcal infection? It is 1 week. For Haemophilus influenza and strep pneumoniae, it is around 10 days to 2 weeks, and rarely it is required to be given for 3 weeks, especially Staph aureus, which causes localized abscesses in the brain, and abscesses are very difficult to treat because there is no enough penetration of antibiotics inside the dead tissues and necrotic material. So you have to go on treating these patients for longer time. Same is true about E. coli infections. Other infections like Listeria, monocytogenes, and all rare infections, you can use up to 2 weeks to 3 weeks. General and supportive measures, especially you have to control the metabolic disturbances. You have to correct hypoglycemia, correct metabolic acidemia, correct, pardon for the spelling error, acidemia. Correcting fluids and electrolytes. Steroids are used in children, not in adult practice. In medicine practice, we hardly use steroids. In tubercular meningitis, last time I told you, steroids are must because it's a chronic disabling disease which causes fibrosis, which causes vasculitis, and which causes adhesions. And all these can lead to various complications of chronic complications of TB meningitis. To avoid these complications, there are some situations in TB where steroids we have to use, especially a delicate structure like eye, choroid tubercles or iridocyclitis in case of eye, or very important pericarditis, because if there is a adhesions between two layers of pericardium, it can lead to constrictive pericarditis. Very bad disease, very difficult to treat. On-table mortality is around 50%. And it causes refractory congestive cardiac failure. So I don't want my patient of tubercular pericarditis to go into constrictive pericarditis. So steroids are indicated. Even adrenal insufficiency in case of TB, indication, miliary tuberculosis. So there are certain indications for steroids in management of TB meningitis also. But in pyogenic meningitis, in adult practice, I hardly use steroid because steroid may cause immunosuppression and it may cause worsening. And without knowing whether patient has some focus like CSOA, mastoiditis, or rupture of cribriform plate, or there is a fracture at the base of the skull, empirical steroids can even worsen the condition. So we are careful. In children where there is a bulging fontanelle is very high raised intracranial tension and patient is sinking, you can use steroids, and that sometimes helps in reducing the cerebral edema, and it can change the prognosis other way around. It is favorable decision. Other things are treatment of hyperpyrexia. You can do tepid sponging and paracetamol. Treatment of seizures, you can use various anti-epileptic drugs. This is taken from old textbooks. So diazepam and phenobarbital is mentioned. In today's era, we are using more of levetiracetam, or you can use a newer drug. Even phenytoin sodium you can use, or you can use lamotrigine. So newer, good, less toxic anti-epileptic drugs are available, and now they are the drugs of choice. Even sodium valproate they use. In children they may not use, but in adult practice we use sodium valproate. Treatment of raised intracranial tension, you have to use 20% mannitol, 5 ml per kilogram every 6 hourly. Dose comes to around 250-300 ml per 6 hourly, and then you can taper it off. As long as raised ICT signs persist, like say papilledema, bradycardia, upgoing plantar, or headache, vomiting, you can use this drug mannitol. Sometimes we use it for 7 days, 10 days you can use, but mostly patients require 4 days, 5 days. You can add even Lasix 20 milligrams every 6 hourly, of course by monitoring the central venous pressure and urine output, and don't allow the patient to get dehydrated, and you can use it 12 hourly. Other measures, you have to do volume expansion if the patient has got dehydration and hypovolemia. Sometimes you have dopamine support, corticosteroids, and you have to use heparin if there is a venous sinus thrombosis. If patient has got thrombosis everywhere or bleeding anywhere, in case of meningococcal septicemia, you have to supplement with coagulation factors using fresh frozen plasma or platelets. Yes. Then depending on the occurrence of complications, you have to plan treatment. If there is a subdural empyema or effusions, then pricking of children I'm talking about, where the fontanelles are open, we can just do tapping of the subdural effusion. In adults, this complication is not seen, so we don't have to do anything. And if at all this thing happens, then we have to hand over the patient to neurosurgeon. We have to do burr hole and craniotomy. It's not easy. But in children, you can tap the subdural effusions. Ependymitis, you can tap with the ventricular puncture and drainage. Hydrocephalus, sometimes because of adhesions or obstructive type of hydrocephalus, requires bypass operation, especially a ventriculoperitoneal shunt and drainage of CSF, or sometimes you require dilatation of the aqueduct. SIADH, I told you, up till now there was no definite drug available for SIADH, but last 4-5 years we have got Vaptans which have come, tolvaptan, which is a very specific drug for SIADH. But earlier treatment used to be restriction of fluid. It's a dilutional hyponatremia, so we have to just restrict fluids and supplement serum sodium to correct the dilutional hyponatremia. So that's the treatment of SIADH. SIADH is a transient problem. Within few hours, patient will get conscious, edema will subside in next 2-3 days, and patient will settle down. It just required clinical diagnosis, some easy tests like serum sodium, urinary sodium excretion. You don't have to do levels of vasopressin and ADH. That sort of complicated thing is not required. Just withdrawal of or stoppage of fluids and correction of sodium. So once you treat the complication, most of the patients with proper antibiotic therapy should do well unless they have a complication. Any patient who has got sagittal sinus thrombosis or has brain abscess, rarely if it is a vasculitis, vessel inflammation, or communicating hydrocephalus. Now, these are the very deadly complications which can alter the prognosis, which can make prognosis bad. If it is a depressed fracture of the base of the skull and CSA rhinorrhea, CSA leak, again one problem, very difficult to treat because CSA space is now open to outside bacteria. So where long-term antibiotic therapy and neurosurgeon's help is required. But most of the patients who do not have complication, if you use proper antibiotics, select antibiotic properly, give proper dosages. Proper dosages meaning if you start a very low dose in the beginning, if you use antibiotic of less uh, strength, less power in the beginning, and then try to escalate later on, by the time patient worsens, it is a changing the patient's illness in futile. You are not going to catch. But if you use correct antibiotic, correct dose meaning double dose in the beginning to achieve the adequate blood levels, correct dose, and very important, as early as possible. Every hour delay in starting antibiotics, the mortality goes up 10%, goes up by 10%. So you have to do CSF quickly, go to the laboratory, get the CSF report in less than 1 hour, less than half an hour, I'll say. My teacher used to say it is a HPLP. HPLP means Houseman Pursuit Lumbar Puncture. Meaning what? Houseman has to run with the CSF sample to the laboratory. If you see how the things work in the hospital, if you do CSF and hand it over to the nurse and tell that send this to the lab, it will remain on ICU counter for 1 hour. Then a Wardaya comes. She will take that sample. On the way, she will meet another 2-3 friends. They will have chit chat. They go to the canteen. Then they go to the general store to collect supplies. And finally, she reaches the laboratory. So there is already 2.5 hours. After that, the person sitting there will again make delay of 1-2 hours. If it is night, worse, 8 hours. So night that sample is kept in the fridge. CSF sample is not to be stagnated, not to be kept in the fridge, because as hours pass, minutes pass by, the cells get lysed and you get a wrong report. So ideally, Houseman has to go with the sample and the CSF sample should go under the microscope in less than 30 minutes or less than 60 minutes before the cells get lysed, and you have to pick up the diagnosis early. So as early as possible. Supposing there is 2% mortality in pyogenic meningitis in first hour, next 1 hour it goes to 2.1%, raised by 2.2%, goes up by 10%. Another 6 hours it will go to 2.8%. So there is a 60% increase. So like that. So every hour delay will increase the mortality by 10%. So we have to do CSF early, go to the lab, study it, and within first hour you have to give some antibiotic. So the correct dose of antibiotic first, and proper dose, and as early as possible. Now, if you follow these 3 principles, any septicemia or meningitis patient, you can do well. Salvage his life. If you do not do this in children, especially, mortality remains very high in the tune of 5 to 30%. And unfortunately, if you do not make a correct diagnosis for a few days, there is a 50% chance that survivals will have some sequelae of the disease, chronic complications of the disease. So what are the factors which cause bad prognosis? Age of the patient. Very young or very old patient, immunocompromised patients, now they have got more chance of mortality. So extremes of age. Causative organism. If it is a very malignant organism, meningococcal septicemia, then chances of survival become less compared to the routine pneumococcal meningitis. Then number of organisms and bacterial virulence. Something like we are discussing in corona today. Higher the dose of virus you receive, more chance that you will go into ICU and you will have a chance of succumbing to the illness. Especially people who are working in ICU and intubating the patients, and anesthetists and surgeons who are dealing with the peritoneal fluid. Peritoneum has got a very high incidence, high percentage of coronavirus. So if patient, some people who are dealing with this, they get a major dose. If you are having a casual touch with a corona patient and if you get few lakh viruses, I will say it is a subclinical exposure. Same applies here also. So if there is a very severe exposure to the bacterium and bacterial virulence is very high, then there is a chance that patient may worsen and succumb to the illness. Then already we discussed this point, duration of illness prior to the effective antibiotics. Every hour delay will increase chances of mortality, chances of complication. then correct therapy. If you choose wrong antibiotic, or if you make a wrong diagnosis of bacterial infection and go on giving antibiotics, then there is going to be especially for conditions like diabetes and host response, immunocompromised patients and HIV patients, they avoid. In absence of all these things, especially if it's a no extreme age patient, not immunodeficient patient, if you have made correct diagnosis, early diagnosis, proper antibiotics, then you can save most of the lives. Otherwise, the mortality is around 30%. Thank you. If you have any questions, queries, I think